Good morning. This hearing will now come to order. As this hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's hearing, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You'll notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order in the order of their arrival. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members may send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Well, good morning and welcome to today's budget hearing. Today we are examining the Department of Agriculture's fiscal year 2023 budget request. I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished witness today, Secretary Tom Vilsack. Thank you for being here, sir. It was good having you in Albany, Georgia last week to announce USDA's investment in Radium Springs and to highlight the impact of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and what it will have and how it will impact rural communities across our country. Now, this budget comes to Congress at a very important moment in time. For the past 2 years, USDA has played a major part in the government's response to COVID-19 through 6 coronavirus relief bills, including the American Rescue Plan Act. Congress entrusted USDA with tens of billions of dollars and additional flexibilities. For those funds and authorities, USDA is helping to put food on the table both at home and at school by expanding access to food programs. USDA is strengthening the food supply chain by investing in infrastructure and support for food processors and local food systems to build resiliency in the food supply. And USDA is doubling down on its efforts in rural America, including investments to support rural hospitals, local communities, rental assistance for low-income and elderly borrowers, and further investments in broadband expansion. But even as some aspects of the pandemic response wind down, there are issues such as addressing climate change, securing the food supply chain, ensuring more of our rural communities have access to the same high-speed internet as our suburban and urban communities, that will keep USDA at the forefront of American policy priorities for the foreseeable future. With all that as the backdrop, USDA's FY 2023 request for the subcommittee is $23.6 billion, an increase of $2.2 billion or 10% over FY 22. Overall, I am pleased that this budget continues to build on agency-wide priorities that were funded in FY 22, including investments to ensure equitable participation in USDA programs, address the impacts of climate change, and support staff and leadership offices at USDA. Notable investments include a $200 million increase for the Reconnect program, a $119 million increase for the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, $50 million to expand conservation assistance to beginning, historically underserved, or veteran farmers, fully funding the SNAP, Child Nutrition, and WIC programs to meet expected participation in FY 2023. So today I'll be interested to hear about how USDA can improve the quality of life in our communities, how its work affects the lives of every American on a daily basis. Secretary Vilsack, thank you again for being here. I appreciate all of the work that you've done in a little over a year, and I look forward to working with you as the FY 2023 process moves forward. Now let me ask our distinguished ranking member, Dr. Harris, if he has any opening remarks, and if so, I would like to recognize him at this time. Dr. Harris.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop. Thank you, Secretary Vilsack. I also want to welcome you to today's hearing. I look forward to discussing the U.S. Department of Agriculture's fiscal year 23 budget request and some other topics of importance. Now, the USDA's budget request for the Agriculture Subcommittee, as the chair has just indicated, is an increase of 10% over last year's level, which is a large increase. Yet this request doesn't address the immediate concerns on the minds of consumers, farmers, and ranchers, such as inflation, which is at a 40-year high at 8.5% and began skyrocketing well before the war in Ukraine. Supply chain issues continue to affect the agriculture industry, from bottlenecks at shipping terminals, labor shortages in the trucking and rail industries, and farm equipment and parts in short supplies. It's unfortunate the president's budget includes provisions threatening the stepped-up basis and imposing capital gains taxes on hardworking farm families to pay for his climate agenda and other big government spending. These ideas have been rejected by Congress before, when the administration tried to sell the American people on the Build Back Better plan, which included those provisions, and I expect these proposals will meet the same fate again. Now, with the war in Ukraine, we are on the brink of a global food crisis. America's producers are the most innovative, efficient, and capable in the world, and are ready to step in to fill the needs. But when fertilizer costs are up more than 300% in some areas, there are significant concerns among producers about the future. Rising energy and input costs in agriculture are taking away from the momentum of higher commodity prices that might help producers break even or be just above the bottom line. USDA needs to be communicating the department's plan to address this global food crisis and support producers in meeting the increased global demand. While this subcommittee is responsible for discretionary funding, I think it's important that we maintain close oversight of the mandatory spending as well. USDA has proven itself quite capable of single-handedly increasing mandatory spending without a blink from the Office of Management and Budget or approval from Congress. Last year, USDA unilaterally increased spending $20 billion a year on the SNAP program by reevaluating the Thrifty Food Plan, which is a market basket of foods a household should purchase for a healthy diet and is used to establish SNAP benefit levels. As stewards of taxpayer dollars, we have an obligation to scrutinize mandatory funding when it goes beyond what Congress has authorized or intended, and that was one example. My Republican colleagues at the House and Senate Agriculture Committee have asked the GAO to review USDA's methodology for reevaluating the Thrifty Food Plan, and I look forward to the results of that review. Mr. Secretary, we had a chance to visit a few months ago, so you know that I have a large poultry district, and I'm closely watching the highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak. Appreciate the recent meeting I had with the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service Administrator, Kevin Shea, and want to continue working with USDA on addressing this very destructive disease. I'm also monitoring the Packers and Stockyards Act rulemaking process with great concern to my constituents. Greater transparency and competition in the livestock and poultry markets is well-intentioned, but there could be unintended consequences, so I'll be closely watching as the department moves forward with an analysis of the economic effect of any changes. Again, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you being with us and look forward to today's hearing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I'm not sure if The chair of the full committee, Mr. Laura, is on the line. Is she? If so, I would recognize her. If not, I would also recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Granger, if she is on the line, if she is available. Hearing from neither at this time, I'd like to recognize Secretary Vilsack. And without objection, sir, your entire written testimony will be included in the record. And I will recognize you now for your opening statement, and then we will proceed with questions.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. You know, I don't think it needs, this committee doesn't need to be reminded. Perhaps those who are watching this hearing need to remember the importance and significance of the food and agriculture industry in our country. It is a critical part of our infrastructure. Our food independence is critical to our national security. It contributes nearly 20% to our nation's economic activity, plays an important role in 10 critical infrastructure sectors, everything from food and health and water to manufacturing and finance and transportation, and is responsible for employing nearly 29 million Americans. Our national security interests are intimately tied to the strategic investment in the Department of Agriculture in this sector and to rural America. The sector's assets, the supply chain systems and networks provide vital services to our nation and are essential to our security, our economic vitality, and our way of life. I want to spend the remaining minutes of my time this morning talking about three specific areas that often do not get the kind of attention that I think they deserve. Let me begin with the fact that as of today, the Department of Agriculture has 5,300 fewer people working at it than it did when I left office in January of 2017. This is despite the fact that both the discretionary and mandatory budgets have increased. The discretionary budget has been increased by 18%, and the programmatic spending has increased by several $billions. Okay. The reality is that effective management of the resources that you all provide does in fact require staffing. We have critical shortages in rural development, in our food and nutrition and community consumer service area, and in our Nrcs area, conservation area. As we look at this budget, you're going to see a request for additional staffing, and it is a response to the fact that we are down by 5,300 folks. Now, why is that? I think there are two fundamental reasons, and appreciate the fact that this committee last year, for the first time in quite a while, not only approved pay increases for workers, but also provided the resources for those pay increases. In the past, that's not been the case. And the result is that oftentimes we have to reduce staff in order to cover the cost of pay increases. At the same time, while non-discretionary spending grew from 2014 to 2021 by 27.4%, USDA's discretionary budget grew by only 14%, roughly one half of other agencies. During the course of the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen non-defense spending by Congress increase by 21%, while USDA's increase was less than 6%. So I would suggest to you that as you look at this budget, please bear in mind the relative position that USDA bears to other non-defense administrations and the important work that we do at USDA. The second area I'd like to talk about briefly is research. You know, it's interesting, over the last 24 years, healthcare research has increased by over 400%. R&D research at the USDA, however, over the last 10 years, if you take inflation into consideration, has essentially been flatlined. I would suggest to you that it's important and necessary for us to pay attention to agricultural research. As I'm often reminded, while healthcare research can cure diseases, USDA research can prevent disease, both in terms of people and in terms of animals. Our agricultural share of the total federal investment in non-defense R&D over the last 20 years or so has declined from 4.3% of the overall non-defense R&D to now 2.3%. So I would encourage this committee to take a look at the important role that research can play and the necessity of having adequate resources. We are falling behind in ag research to our friends in China, And that is an area that I don't think we want to essentially be second place in. And I think it ultimately has negative implications for agricultural productivity and our ability to deal with the pests and diseases that we are currently dealing with and those that may occur as a result of climate change. The last item I want to visit with in the remaining time that I have is just to remind the committee of the importance of our rental housing portfolio at USDA. We have over 403,000 units that we essentially provide resources to and able to have families have access to affordable rental housing. Unfortunately, many of the mortgages on those properties are going to be paid off in the very near future. And as they are, those units are going to come out of the rental assistance program, which is going to create some challenges for families. In addition, we have not over a period of time invested in revitalizing and rehabbing many of those units. In fact, we're going to begin to see a loss of thousands of units as a result. So we're requesting additional resources to allow us to upgrade the rental housing stock in rural America so that we can continue to provide decent housing for those who want to live, work, and raise their families in rural communities. Mr. Chairman, I know there are a variety of issues that you all want to discuss, and so I'll stop there and look forward to the questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We will now proceed with questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will begin with the chair and ranking member, then alternating majority and minority with members present at the time the hearing started in order of seniority. After that, I will recognize members not present at the time the hearing is called to order in their order of arrival. Each member will have 5 minutes in each round, so please be mindful of your time. I will now recognize myself for questions. Mr. Secretary, I was interested in your comments because in February, during the Agriculture Committee hearing on farm policy, I asked Undersecretary Bonnie about staffing concerns in the farm production and conservation mission area. And I recognize the increased workload over the past few years, especially at FSA, due to ad hoc programs like the Market Facilitation Program, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, and the Wildfire and Hurricane Indemnity Program. We're all glad that USDA has the flexibility to create and administer these programs in support of our producers, but ensuring FSA is fully staffed is key to their effective and timely delivery, and I'm happy that you have recognized that and brought that to the forefront in your budget request. You request an additional 64 employees for FSA, an additional 535 for conservation technical assistance in NRCS, noting expanded staffing capacity is needed to keep pace with increased mandatory financial assistance authorities that will exceed $3 billion in 2023. And I'm happy that you are asking for additional resources for staffing. My question is, will these requests meet the need to do the core work, especially at FSA? And I'm concerned that those 64 employees may not be able to keep pace with retirements and attrition. And while we're discussing FSA staffing levels and workload, can you provide the committee with an update of the timing for the WHIP disaster implementation and sign up for the 2020 and 21 crop year losses?
Mr. Chairman, I'm confident that our request will allow us to continue to do the good work at FSA offices across the United States. NRCS is a different story. The reality is we have to have people working individually with producers, particularly with those who have been historically underserved, so that they fully understand and appreciate the programs that are available to them. We also have, as you know, an expanded urban agricultural presence, which is going to require as well additional resources for NRCS. So between the two, I think we have made a request that will allow us to continue to do the work that is incredibly important. And I will tell you that this is an organization that last fiscal year, basically provided over 53,000 farm loans to farmers in need, and also provided nearly 43,000 NRCS contracts, conservation contracts, which were approved, in addition to all of the pandemic assistance and all of the additional assistance that was forthcoming as a result of a variety of programs that you all have funded recently.
The administration has rightfully made ensuring equitable participation in USDA programs a top priority. And 2 weeks ago, you released the USDA's Equity Action Plan. And two findings stood out to me in particular. First, that USDA farm programs are tailored to the needs of larger agricultural producers. And second, that FSA and RMA have had very few programs and avenues providing technical assistance and support to organizations that help underserved farmers and ranchers. So I've been concerned that a majority of financial and technical assistance goes to larger farmers, and I'm glad that this is being recognized. Can you discuss the unique challenges that our small farmers face? Is there anything that we need to do in our FY23 bill to address these identified gaps in service?
Well, fortunately, Mr. Chairman, you passed the American Rescue Plan, which provided us the resources to begin a process of creating relationships between USDA and a series of community building organizations that can provide technical assistance, trusted organizations and communities to reach out to historically underserved producers and to provide the one-on-one information and contact that's necessary for those producers to understand A, what's available, and B, how to basically qualify for it. In addition, you also provided resources for us to adequately fund the heirs property relending program, which is going to allow us to enable those fractionated interests and the owners of that land to be able to consolidate land ownership so that they are able to participate fully in programs. Our risk management folks have found $2 million to provide additional outreach, and they've begun to craft a series of programs and risk management tools that are directly connected to and speak to this issue of small and mid-sized producers. They recently announced a micro loan program or micro crop insurance program that's providing crop insurance protection for facilities that have less than $100,000 in sales. So there's a tremendous opportunity here and a tremendous outreach effort that's undertaken in order to ensure folks get the access to the programs they need.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time is up, and we'll now go to Dr. Harris. And Dr. Harris, you are now recognized for your questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Now, I've read your written remarks to the committee, and the second paragraph talks about economic indicators that are overwhelmingly positive. So I'm not sure when this was written, but I'm sure you're aware that the GDP actually contracted 1.4% last quarter. That's not economically positive. We have inflation at historic highs. That's not economically positive. We have interest rate increases that are being planned that will likely result, and most economists feel most likely result in a recession. That's not economically positive. And a majority of Americans simply disagree that they think the economy is in good shape. So I'm not sure, if we start from an unrealistic predicate, then we're going to make bad decisions. So for instance, you talked about 5,000 fewer employees, but in an organization that has nearly 100,000 employees, that's just doing a little more with a little less. And I think that's what Americans expect from us as our $1 trillion deficits fuel inflation. And the American people have figured it out. I think we have to look at ways of doing more with less in the government, not doing the same with more, which I think is what you suggest when you suggest that we have to add employees, for instance, in the FNS program, which should be winding down because of the wind down in some of the funds, some of the COVID funds. We should actually require fewer employees than we have now as these funds wind down. So that leads into my question about the supplementary, the SNAP program. If the administration is doing so well with the economy, why do you estimate SNAP participation will actually increase 1.2 million people next year? Because the SNAP program is usually a reverse indicator of the economy. Economy gets better, SNAP participation goes down because fewer people qualify. But you project an increase. So do you believe the economy is getting better or not?
Well, I think it's a balanced, I think the response is a balanced view here. You've mentioned some of the challenges that we have with inflation, and that's true. But you didn't mention the fact that we've had significant job growth recently. And while that is good news, we still have a challenge in many areas of the country in terms of unemployment rates that continue to be high, particularly in persistently poor areas. I was recently in Mississippi, and communities where the poverty rate has been in excess of 20% for over 20 years. So there's still challenges. number one. Number two, I think it's important to recognize that we need to continue to look for ways in which those who are eligible for programs actually participate in the programs. One of the areas in SNAP that we want to continue to focus on are senior citizens, folks who are who have retired, who are on fixed incomes, perhaps it's a Social Security check, who actually qualify for SNAP, but currently aren't receiving the benefit of SNAP. It's in our best interest to make sure folks have access to these programs. The same thing is true with our WIC program. 50% of those who are eligible for that program don't participate in that program, Congressman. And so therefore, it's important for us to continue to look for ways in which we can make sure that the programs that you all have created are available and utilized by the people that they are designed for.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate the answer, but I hope that's weighed again in a time when you paint this incredibly rosy picture of the economy with millions of people getting more jobs. That should actually take millions of people off of being eligible for SNAP benefits. Now, I know that you know that GIPSA is a concern of mine. My Republican counterparts in the House and Senate Ag Committee sent you a letter about the importance of doing a comprehensive economic analysis, updated economic analysis. Your reply was a little vague. Again, I look forward to seeing that economic analysis. Will you still commit to ensuring that a proper updated economic analysis is going to be performed on that?
Yes.
Okay, great. The Reconnect Broadband program is again, the rural areas do need broadband. That was so clearly exemplified during the COVID crisis. And I'm glad that we have more resources. But is the USDA coordinating? Because now we have several agencies involved. Are you coordinating with the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to ensure that we're not duplicating? As we're sending all this money out there, that we're actually spending it efficiently, wisely, and not duplicating government effort?
We're sharing data through a MOU that was recently signed. We have weekly meetings. We're basically coordinating our mapping as well. So yes, that coordination is taking place. And the goal obviously is to avoid duplicating and providing double coverage and not being able to provide coverage throughout the entire country. That's the goal here, is to get everyone access to high-speed internet.
Oh, thank you so much, because again, we have the resources now. Let's go and get it done. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. At this time, I'm delighted to recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us. One of the things I wanted to lead with is to thank you for that additional money for SNAP and the outreach to find making sure that everyone who needs that program has access to that program. Perhaps in a body made up of half millionaires, we don't quite understand the need for SNAP like people in my district do. And even though we're coming out of COVID, there's some industries that have not and some populations that have not. So thank you for that increase in the budget. I'd like to get to three subject areas, and I think the first two you can probably answer fairly quickly, and maybe leave a little more time for the third, just kind of giving you a little upfront. ARS buildings and facilities, those agriculture research buildings are so important. We recently in the omnibus got money to replace a World War II era building that we had in Wisconsin, in my district. I appreciate that. But we also know that with increased costs, some of those building costs are going to be more than people anticipated in these buildings across the country. I'm hearing estimates of price increases that are approaching $200 million. So my question is, are we able to support meeting these needs in the fiscal year 2023 appropriations bill? And how can we make sure that, with these increases, when people have budgeted for something, that there may be the additional support for these buildings to still be able to get off the ground?
It's a great question, and I will be honest with you, it's a challenge. We've got 23 or so projects that were adequately and fully funded by Congress in previous budgets. We now are very concerned about the increased cost and the impact on those 23. We have several that are partially funded, which obviously will impact. We're going to continue to look for ways in which we can stretch those dollars. These facilities are incredibly important to our research priorities, and so we're going to continue to look for ways to make sure we do as much as we can with the resources that we have.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Community facility loans. We've had a couple communities in my district last year that through some of your department's critical functions, you're providing financing for infrastructure in rural communities. We're grateful that they approved these community facility loans for projects in Baraboo and Lafayette. in my district. However, both of these communities ran into the same issue in dealing with rural development and ultimately had to have their loan underwritten twice, once by the state office and then once by the federal office. That put both projects in jeopardy because of the length of time it took. And honestly, I ran out of excuses in talking to them along the way. Can you speak to why there's this process that it's now taking twice to have some of these loans underwritten, and what we could do to maybe streamline that timeline?
Congressman, that is a question that I don't have a very good answer to, but it's a concerning question that you ask. And what I will do is I will go back to our team and ask the question why we've made it more difficult. The goal here should be to be making it easier instead of more difficult.
Yeah, and I know that is your goal. And that's why I said maybe this is more raising awareness, but in two communities, we had this problem. In one, it was a little embarrassing every time I went up there, I didn't have an answer for him. And at least, everything is taken care of now, but it is an issue. Finally, I want to thank you for the additional money that you have in antitrust enforcement you asked for, specifically what I would call the meatpacking cartel in this country. As we know, we have very few companies that are doing this. And yet at a hearing this week, again, they deny any price fixing and everything else, but we're hearing from the actual cattle ranchers that they're at some of the lowest prices and they're barely getting by. As you look at this money, how can some of this go to try and address the cost increases that people are right now experiencing? Because I truly believe this is one where price gouging is at the center of why we have some of these increases around meat.
I think there are three things. First of all, it's important and necessary for us to have continued competition and expanded competition, which is why we've announced a series of programs to help existing processing facilities that are small and mid-sized stay in business and be able to expand, while we have also addressed and will be addressing this summer the expansion of new facilities to provide competition. Secondly, I think it's about transparency. We are, in fact, looking at the Packers and Stockyard rules and making sure that they are strong enough to be able to send a clear message that it's not appropriate to take advantage of producers. And then finally, it is, in fact, once you have strengthened Packers and Stockyard's capacity, basically having the resources to be able to call people and hold people accountable. And that's the intent of what we expect to be able to do at USDA.
Well, with my time left, I'm going to make sure I'm respectful of the chairman's request, but thank you very much on this front. And I really look forward to what we're able to do. So thanks so much. Appreciate it. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. O'Kane. At this time, I'm delighted to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, you are recognized.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Chairman. Secretary Vilsack, thank you for coming today to testify in front of the subcommittee. The jurisdiction of your department includes one of the most important issues to agriculture producers in rural communities, members throughout my district and in the Central Valley of California. And personally, I'd like to thank you for taking some time to personally come out and visit the district a few months back. I really appreciate that. But since you last testified, the water conditions have unfortunately not improved throughout the West, particularly in the Central Valley. Despite the adoption of more modern, efficient technologies, including drip, farmland in my district continues to be fallowed, wells are going dry. And your testimony highlights the importance of all Americans to, as you say, have access to healthy, affordable food. And I couldn't agree more. But it's situations like the one we are currently facing in the West, along with supply chain issues and workforce shortages, that are proving to make this task a much more difficult task than it should be. Last spring, President Biden established the Drought Relief Working Group, of which you were a part. Please update us on what you and the other task force members are doing to assist agriculture producers and rural communities as it relates to the horrible effects of the ongoing drought.
Well, there are several things, Congressman. First of all, we're in the process of providing the resources that you all provided under the WIP Plus program. We just recently put out about $550 million to livestock producers that were impacted by a series of weather-related issues. We've basically simplified that process. We anticipate and expect that we will begin to get the payments to crop producers out in May and early June. And that process is going to result in resources getting to farmers relatively quickly. We also have obviously making sure that folks take full advantage of the livestock indemnity program. The crop insurance, the NAP program is available. We've recently made sure that folks were aware of the emergency assistance for livestock, honeybee, and farm-raised fish, and expanded that opportunity not only to cover indemnity, but also to cover transportation expenses. So we've looked for ways in which we can make it a little bit easier. We continue to work on our modeling. We continue to work on providing information to producers so they can make the most informed decisions concerning what they can do and where they can do it. We continue to focus on our climate hubs to provide additional ways of mitigating and adaptation strategies. So there's, I think, a series of things that we've done, and we will continue to look for ways in which we can provide assistance and help.
I appreciate that, and hopefully we can work together on that, because that situation is going to get more dire as the weather warms up. So Secretary Vilsack, the next issue for me is farmers in my district have had nearly 4 years of market turmoil overseas and here at home. At this very moment, the industry faces millions in losses every day simply because they cannot get their goods onto ships out of port. We have seen government purchasing sprees for feeding programs and support payments, but these actions miss the mark in significantly connecting our farmers and ranchers' abundance of food with our growing population. Simply put, USDA must be more aggressive to promote our homegrown agriculture goods and encourage U.S. consumers to support our local farmers. How does the USDA plan to address the ongoing challenge, especially with the port situation, and take action to ramp up domestic consumption and promotion of U.S. products?
Well, we've had an opportunity to work with the Port of Oakland and the Port of Seattle to create essentially a pop-up location, which hopefully will increase the utilization of empty containers that have been leaving our ports without agricultural products to be essentially with agricultural products. We had a record year in exports last year. We anticipate and expect a record year as well this year, but there is obviously continued work. We continue to reach out to shippers, have had communications and contact with the shippers to encourage them to do a better job. We are obviously taking a look at what you all in Congress can do in terms of the legislation that's being proposed to essentially provide some additional tools. We continue to work with the Maritime Commission to encourage them to use the tools that are available. We recently talked to the National Surface Transportation Board to deal with the rail issues that have been problematic. We continue to work with our sister agencies to encourage an acceleration of CDLs so we get folks behind the wheels of trucks to be able to move product into market both domestically and internationally. We're going to continue to look for creative ways. We're open to ideas and thoughts. And Congressman, if you have ideas and thoughts about what we need to be doing that we're not doing, I'm more than happy to hear from you and to be able to direct some of the resources that we have available for that purpose.
And I appreciate that. With the 5-minute time limit, it's hard to get into those types of details here, but I do look forward to that opportunity to continue this dialogue, because a lot of the ideas that you mentioned are helpful. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act, if we can get that out of the Congress over to the president's desk, I think that would be helpful. But the reality is farmers are seeing lower prices. I mean, almonds are in low, pistachios still not very well. Met with my walnut guys. I mean, these guys are all truly struggling because they can't get product onto ships. So I appreciate the efforts, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Valadeo. I now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Vilsack and Mr. Rapp, for joining us for this hearing today. I've been hearing from farmers in my district who are facing increased input costs, including the cost of fertilizer, and I'm hearing that it's cutting into their bottom lines. Pandemic-related supply chain disruptions and Putin's unprovoked war against Ukraine have undoubtedly contributed to this problem. But we also know that a longstanding significant factor has been the trends of market consolidation and anti-competitive practices in the agriculture industry. We also understand that the vast majority of our fertilizer supply is controlled by a small number of large corporations, which is similar to what's happening with our meat processing system. And so, you know, farmers and producers are absorbing high costs and accepting unfair contracts because huge corporations know that they don't have a choice. It's also threatening the sustainability of smaller farms. It's destabilizing our food supply and harming consumers. We know that the Biden administration and USDA are taking action, including a recent announcement that USDA is setting up a $250 million grant program to support independent and sustainable American fertilizer production. Can you give us an update on the status of this grant program, including when this funding will become available and whether it will continue for fiscal year 23?
Well, I appreciate the question. Our intent and goal is to try to solicit information, which we're doing at this point in time, on ideas about how best to use those resources. I would expect and anticipate that we will close that information gathering process sometime this summer and begin to make decisions in terms of how best to allocate those resources and perhaps even add to those resources. I would also say that we've taken additional action. We're working with state attorney generals who are currently doing a market study of the very issue that you talked about in terms of consolidation and whether or not these price increases that farmers have seen are justified. We continue to do research on ways in which we potentially could use less fertilizer. We continue to look for ways in which we can encourage farmers to use conservation practices and crop decisions that may result in the need for less fertilizer. And we've recently provided a new risk management tool to encourage farmers, particularly in the Midwest, to consider only a single application of nitrogen fertilizer. And then if they suffer product loss as a result, productivity loss, we would have an opportunity to provide some additional resources to sort of offset that loss. So there's a variety of ways in which we are currently trying to address this issue in a very aggressive way.
I appreciate that, but for the grant, do you have any estimation for fiscal year 23?
Well, our goal is to obviously make decisions before the end of this fiscal year. These resources we've utilized these resources from CCC. So it's an opportunity for us to basically figure out what is it that farmers, what is it that the market believes needs to be done. It's not an easy issue. It's a relatively complicated issue. And we may find that we need to put more resources behind this initiative. And that's one of the reasons why we're collecting information.
Okay. I'm also very pleased that USDA and the Department of Justice are working together to increase enforcement of federal antitrust laws in the Packers and Stockyards Act, including setting up a joint online portal for producers to report potential violations. Can you provide an update on the progress of this joint USDA-DOJ effort so far? And does this scope extend beyond the meat processing sector, for example, into fertilizer, seed, and other industries?
We continue to monitor the portal for information that would allow the Department of Justice to make decisions about whether or not cases should be pursued. In the meantime, what we're doing at USDA is the process of strengthening the Packers and Stockyards Act to make sure that we have an act that in fact provides a balanced and level playing field for producers. You will probably see in the very near future our efforts in terms of the poultry tournament system, providing greater transparency and fairness in that system. That will be followed by a focus on discrimination and retaliation to basically provide some relief in circumstances where folks are being discriminated against or retaliated against. And then we will have a rule at some point in time this year on undue preferences. So there's an effort to try to strengthen our capacity to take action.
In addition to unfair and anti-competitive forces in agricultural input industries and the markets for agricultural goods, our small and mid-sized farmers are up against farmland consolidation. For decades, federal policy has consistently favored large farm operations, and startup farms and small farms have struggled to access USDA resources. What efforts are you all taking to reverse those trends?
Well, the first thing we did is to establish the rule that was in the 2018 Farm Bill for heirs property to basically allow the consolidated or fractionated interests into a single owner so that individuals could qualify for programs that would allow them potentially to purchase land. Secondly, as you may know, under the American Rescue Plan, Section 1006, there are resources for us to figure out ways in which we can provide access to land. This is a complicated issue. We're looking at ways in which, for example, federal lands could potentially be made more readily available to historically underserved producers. We're working with our outreach partners. We've recently provided $75 million in resources to 20 different organizations and groups to help us understand how we can best provide not only land access, but also market access. You can have land, but if you don't have markets, you need both. And we're in the process of trying to figure out ways in which we can expand both land and access and market access.
Thanks, I yield
Ms.
back.
Secretary, and thank you, Ms. Underwood, for your very insightful questions. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop, Mr. Chairman, appreciate that. Good to see you, Secretary Vilsack. Thanks for being with us today. Let me associate myself with some of the remarks you've already heard. As one of the farmers that's serving in Congress, as you well know, there's a lot of anxiety in ag country these days. A lot of challenges that we face, and certainly appreciate your efforts and recognizing those facts and all the hard work the agency is doing to assist the industry. I wanted to, first of all, something is very important to me. I want to thank you for your support of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, particularly your testimony. I think it was last fall, last year anyway, in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'm sure in your travels around the country, you're hearing, just like I am, that labor is one of the biggest issues facing our farmers and our ranchers. You know, it goes without saying that our immigration laws are broken. We need to fix them. We need meaningful immigration reform. We got to have a legal workforce and an available workforce. And appreciate your efforts on that. And I'm hopeful still, and I appreciate if you could continue to put some urgency in the Senate as much as you can with your strong voice, we can get something done this year to pass that legislation into law. Kind of an unrelated topic, though. I wanted to touch on the dietary guidelines for Americans issue. As you well aware, the last few rewrites of the DGA have been criticized, from several different sectors. Congress has repeatedly urged the USDA to, and the HHS, I should say, to improve the transparency, the process, the objectivity, and to rely on the preponderance of scientific evidence to make any changes. You're well aware that Congress, at least twice over the last several years, have mandated that the NASM, or the National Academies of Science and Engineering and Medicine, to review the DGA process and report back to us, as well as other relevant agencies with recommendations. We've also weighed in as part of the Fiscal Year 22 Appropriations Act, directing NASM to further review the 2020 process and advise the agencies on how the next rewrite could be improved. So it's, Mr. Secretary, it's my understanding these recommendations from NASM are still not out. Admittedly, there have been some starts and stops, but to complicate things, your agency as well as HHS issued in April a Federal Register notice that the process to write the new 2025 to 2030 dietary guidelines has begun, including the release of the proposed research questions to be considered by the next committee. So a couple things, and maybe I'll ask several questions here, and in your response, you can touch on some of them. Can you help us feel assured that the work of NASM is not being ignored? And how will the department plan to incorporate the findings and recommendations of NASM's review? And could you inform me why the committee's work at the NASM was put on hold for 2 months earlier this year? And why, essentially, why the start and stop that we're seeing? And will you assure that the department will incorporate the findings and recommendations of any NASM review into the development of the new guidelines? And then particularly, was the decision not to have the next DGA committee focus on any alcohol research questions a result of recommendations from the NASM, or was that a recommendation from another federal agency? I know there's a lot there, but if you could respond, I'd appreciate that.
Well, I think the key takeaway to your question, Congressman, about the DGAs is the amount of time it takes to actually get this done in an orderly and proper fashion. So it's important for us to have started this process now by basically putting together a set of questions which we are asking people to respond to and react to. It may very well be that the set of questions that we propose aren't in fact the set of questions that we actually present to the researchers. for consideration because we may get pushback. We may get, hey, you left out this or you shouldn't have included that. That's the whole purpose here. The whole purpose is to give people an opportunity to weigh in on whether we're hitting the mark or missing the mark. And I would expect and anticipate, to the extent that the research and review of the DGAs comes up with proposals to strengthen the effort to make sure that we are in fact following the science, there would be no reason why we wouldn't be interested in adopting those. Obviously, we've got a partner in this, an HHS, and they have a say in it as well. In fact, they're the lead agency for this go round. But we'll continue to work hard to try to make sure these dietary guidelines are appropriate and supported by the science.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newhouse and Secretary Vilsack. At this time, we have been joined by the distinguished chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Connecticut, Mr. Laurel. At this time, recognizing her busy schedule and conflicting hearings today, I'd like to recognize her for 5 minutes for whatever purpose she may deem appropriate.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank my colleagues on the committee as well for allowing me to move forward. And it's wonderful to see you, Mr. Secretary, again, and thank you for your testimony, but thank you for your many years of dedication and hard work always in this area. I have questions that I will submit for the record, but I wanted to speak about an extremely disturbing report that I recently acquired from a whistleblower who worked at the Abbott facility, which produces infant formula, recalled by the FDA in February. Chairman Bishop, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share this during this hearing. Mr. Secretary, to my knowledge, you have not seen this report, and I bring it to your attention because I know of your deep commitment to child nutrition and the WIC program's importance to maternal and child health outcomes. Abbott Nutrition is the exclusive supplier for the majority of state WIC agencies, and this has a serious impact on families served by WIC. Over 1.2 million infants served by WIC are limited to specific brands of contract formula like Similac. I believe you will be as outraged as I am and by what this report means for the health of those infants. In September 2021, FDA learned of the potential link between a rare and deadly foodborne pathogen in powdered infant formula manufactured by Abbott Laboratories in a facility in Sturgis, Michigan. This week, I received a 34-page report from a whistleblower, a former employee at the plant, which produced the contaminated formula, which led to at least 4 hospitalizations and the deaths of at least 2 babies. The whistleblower report lays out a damning list of allegations of wrongdoing at this factory, including falsification of records relating to testing of seals, signing verifications without adequate knowledge, failure to maintain accurate maintenance records, shipping packages with fill weights lower than what was on the label, and more, releasing untested infant formula, hiding information during the 2019 FDA audit, lax practices associated with clean in-place procedures, lack of traceability of the product, failure to take corrective measures once the company knew their testing procedures were deficient, an atmosphere of retaliation against any employee who raised concerns about company practices. And these are just a few of the allegations laid out in the report. I want to remind everyone we are talking about infant formula. Parents trust that formula will be safe and healthy for their newborn babies. It should be the most regulated of any product. I'm deeply concerned about the practices at this Abbott facility and their apparent failure to implement and enforce internal controls at this facility. We need to know exactly who in the company was aware of this failure and the alleged attempts to hide this information from the FDA. I am equally concerned that the FDA reacted far too slowly to this report. The report was submitted to the FDA on October 19, 2021. The FDA did not interview the whistleblower until late December 2021. According to news reports, FDA did not inspect the plant in person until January 31st, 2022, and the recall was not issued until February 17th, 2022. Why did the FDA not spring into action? Why did it take 4 months to pull this formula off store shelves? How many infants were fed contaminated formula during this time by parents who trusted that formula they were buying was safe? How many additional illnesses and deaths were there due to the FDA's slow response? I've already requested the HHS Inspector General to look into this. I can assure you that this committee will also carry out its oversight role to find answers into how this happened and how we can prevent it from ever happening again. I want to say thank you to the brave whistleblower for coming forward with this critical information. Mr. Secretary, we look to you and the USDA for leadership on issues of child nutrition. I strongly encourage you to investigate USDA's contracts with Abbott Nutrition. If Abbott cannot guarantee the safety of infant formula purchased through the WIC program, the federal government should not be in business with them. I look forward to working with you on this. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit this report to the committee record for this hearing.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
And I want to once again thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know of your interest in the issues of child nutrition and of children being safe with the food that their parents believe that they are eating, and in this particular case, what infants are being fed. So again, thank you very, very much, and I want to thank again my colleagues on the committee for allowing me to move forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank
Thank you very much. At this time, I'm delighted to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes for your questions. You are now recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for this hearing today. And just a few things I wanted to touch base with you on. First of all, just want to reemphasize the importance of rural broadband. And I know that's something that's very high on your radar screen, and just want to continue encouraging movement forward in that. Also, I wanted to talk with you about the avian influenza and just get your thoughts on that going forward and how we're addressing it and what we need to do going forward. And you know, obviously the African swine fever also is a concern as well. But wanted to talk with you briefly about the influenza.
Congressman, as of today, there are roughly 29 states that have dealt with and are dealing with AI. Roughly 200, almost 240 flocks have been impacted and affected. In 21 states, it's both commercial and backyard flocks. In 8 states, it's just simply backyard. We have 585 folks between the federal and state efforts here focused on this on a daily basis. We're concerned, obviously, about rapid spread, and that's why we have encouraged producers to be very cautious and very careful about biosecurity. I would say that we, I think, have seen improvements in that respect. We more rapidly identify AI, we more rapidly respond, we more rapidly quarantine, we more rapidly depopulate and dispose, and that's compared to where things were in 2014 and 15. We've sequenced about 1,100 genomes of this virus so that we have a sense of where it's headed. About $146 million has been paid in indemnities to this point. We just recently received approval for another $263 million. To put this in proper perspective, that's about half of where we were in 2014, 2015 with the last outbreak. We're going to continue to focus on rapid detection, quick quarantine and disposal, and depopulation and disposal. And hopefully, with the warming temperatures, we'll see an abatement of this virus. Not much you can do in terms of wild flocks, so that's why it's important for producers to be very careful in biosecurity. On African swine fever, obviously the goal here is to make sure it doesn't hit the mainland. We've created a protective zone in Puerto Rico. We're working with the Dominican Republic and Haitian officials to begin the process of trying to get it under control in those countries. We're working with other partners, Mexico, to basically encourage a real focus in the Dominican Republic and Haiti on this issue. We've provided resources, we've provided staff, we've provided lab operations, and we've also bulked up our own security, working with customs folks. We're making sure that the right questions are being asked. And the last thing I would say is we've got a very aggressive advertising and marketing program in airports, basically encouraging folks not to bring into the United States anything that could potentially compromise our pork industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I'm kind of between two hearings this morning, so I appreciate your response and look forward to working with you in the year ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar. And at this time, I am pleased to recognize the gentle lady from New York, Ms. Ming. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Vilsack. It is good to see you again. Thank you so much for being with us today. I wanted to ask about the availability of foods that are certified kosher and halal in the Emergency Food Assistance Program. As you know, there's been a tremendous increase in demand for food assistance nationwide, but unfortunately, there are still very few items that are certified kosher on the TFAP available foods list. That is critical for helping pantries and banks meet this increased demand. Last year, I secured language in the House report urging your department to work with both Jewish and Muslim community leaders on expanding this list to ensure TFAP was accessible for those with culturally or religiously sensitive diets. In September, we then sent a letter signed by 47 of my colleagues requesting an update on USDA's plan. I'm aware that USDA is gathering information, but while I appreciate that a comprehensive strategy will take time, I'd like to know what can be done now to address so many of the unmet needs of individuals with religious or cultural dietary needs in TFAP food boxes. And also, are there particular challenges that USDA is facing in expanding the number of processed or shelf-stabled foods that are certified kosher or halal that are listed on the TFAP available foods list? And does USDA need additional funding to expand kosher and halal options on the list?
Well, one of the things we've done, Congresswoman, is we've begun to try to develop a more robust local and regional connection to the TFAP program. So we have provided resources that will go through states to be able to establish and provide hundreds of millions of dollars of purchasing at the local and regional level. And this is one way of addressing the issue as we're formulating a much more longer term and more comprehensive strategy. It gives the ability to use those resources at the local level to purchase those culturally appropriate foods. We're also doing this, I might add, not only for TFAP, but we're also doing it in relationship to a school nutrition program as well, providing additional resources to schools and encouraging them to utilize this for the purchases at the local level. We also have been working and provided a program called the Reach and Resiliency program with food banks, where we're offering resources to be able to allow them to deal with culturally sensitive foods. And this is also remote and rural areas, as well as the infrastructure. The first wave of those grants should be forthcoming in the very near future. So there's an effort here to provide the resources while we're putting together the plan. I think we have sufficient personnel to put the plan together. Obviously, it somewhat depends on the input that we get in terms of whether or not we have sufficient resources. And once we have a sense of that, we will certainly let you know. Congressman, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you for that. And then I wanted to also ask quickly about hot foods exemption in SNAP. We discussed this last year when you came before this committee. I'm grateful to see your review of the Thrifty Food Plan include an increase to the SNAP benefit to reflect current food prices beneficiaries are facing, but also want to know of any additional efforts to modernize the SNAP program, specifically a permanent repeal of the hot foods provision.
Well, our focus, and to be candid, our focus initially on SNAP was to take a look at the Thrifty Food Plan, not only to take a look at what families are in fact purchasing from the grocery store, but looking at food costs, looking at the dietary guidelines, and looking at what the nutrition science tells us. I will tell you that we continue to look for ways in which we can create greater convenience with reference to SNAP. And we're also doing this as well on the WIC program, basically providing online opportunities, online capacity. I think there's still some policy issues that we have to work through in terms of online access, but we're continuing to focus on trying to make it as convenient as possible.
Thank you. And we are working on SNAP Plus Act legislation, bipartisan effort with Congress members Bobby Rush and Brian Fitzpatrick, which would permanently repeal this exemption in SNAP. And in light of the upcoming Farm Bill reauthorization, would love to work with you and your team to ensure that we're making key nutrition programs accessible to the needs of our current world. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ming. At this time, I'm delighted to recognize my friend, the gentleman from Alabama and the former chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to be on the virtual call today with the Secretary and Mr. Raup. Thank you both for being available today. Of course, it's as we all know, agriculture is a core pillar of American history since the foundation of this country. And it's critical that we ensure that your department is well supported to continue that legacy. And certainly we want to do what we can to make sure that we, from a congressional standpoint and a preparation standpoint, do what we can. Of course, I want to just mention the broadband issue. That is something that resonates with so many of us on this subcommittee and all through Congress and across the United States, whether it be rural districts, whether it be urban districts, whether it be conservative districts, whether it be liberal districts. It is something that really is everybody can agree on. And so it's good occasionally to have those issues that everyone can agree on, and we feel like is important to for the benefit of the entire nation, especially what we've seen after the situation with COVID over the last several, or actually the last couple of years. But I want to pivot a little bit to more on the international side of agriculture. Of course, Russia's unprovoked war on Ukraine has had a ripple effect across the global markets, including the trade of key items like wheat and fertilizers. My question, Mr. Secretary, would be, does the USDA's budget for FY23 address any of the concerns that are emanating from the war in Ukraine and its impact on the global food supply chain?
Mr. Chair, well, I'm kind of used to calling you Mr. Chairman. Congressman, appreciate the question.
Chairman.
Appreciate the question. Our budget basically provides the resources to do what we think is necessary. I would say that we just recently today announced the ability of us to tap in the Bill Emerson Trust to fully utilize all of the resources in that trust to provide food assistance. And we're also utilizing some resources from CCC to reduce the transportation costs associated with getting those products to folks in need. There may very well need to be the need to refill, if you will, the Emerson Trust, and I think there's a provision in perhaps a supplemental bill that will potentially address that issue. So that's a new development, and obviously could not have been taken into consideration at the time the budget was put together, which was pre-invasion. But I would say you want to keep an eye on that issue in terms of our ability to provide additional assistance in the future.
Okay, good to know that is on your radar screen and will be addressed. And then one last thing, if we look beyond the crisis in Ukraine and towards an additional efforts to reshore our supply chain, especially in regards to China, how does USDA's FY23 budget request address our reliance on Chinese exports.
Well, I would say that the concern we have about Chinese exports, Congressman, is the need for us to continue to look for ways in which we can diversify so that we're not as overly reliant on a single market. We know what happened when that market was disrupted during the trade war. We saw the devastation to producers. So we're continually look for ways in which we can expand new market opportunities. The Indo-Pacific framework that was announced by the USTR is one way. Focusing on ways in which we can knock down barriers. Recently, additional beef sales in Japan, additional corn sales and frozen pork sales in Vietnam, potatoes in Mexico. We're breaking down barriers so that we can expand access to additional markets. I think there are opportunities in Southeast Asia. I think there are opportunities in Africa. So the budget basically provides us the opportunity to continue to look for ways in which we can expand presence. At the end of the day, expanding market opportunity is about presence. It's about having people in place, which we have. It's about the resources that MAP and FMD provide to basically have promotions and the opportunity for us to do additional trade missions. So you're going to see a very aggressive effort in trade missions this year. We had one in the Middle East. We've got one scheduled in Spain. We've got one scheduled in Kenya. We've got one scheduled in the Philippines. So there's going to be a continued focus effort on increasing and expanding our presence in these foreign markets so that we diversify and we're not as reliant on China as we have been in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. At this time, I'm happy to recognize my friend from Texas, Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, it's a pleasure seeing you again. I want to first of all say I want to thank you for the work that y'all are doing and the Rural Partners Network. I think it's a great idea, getting the whole of government together, getting all the, I believe about 16 agencies working together. So I certainly want to say thank you so much. Do understand you have the first cohort that went out, and I think there's a second one, but I'm still looking for the state of Texas where we got more colonias than any other place in the rural areas that we have. Just want to see if there's anything we can help you in building capacity, because I know that could be an issue, but we certainly want to work with you on that issue. That's one question on when you think the U.S.-Mexico border can come in. I think New Mexico has been covered, but we have the largest amount of colonias. And then you and I had talked about the colonias coordinators and about appointed, you didn't want to have an office, but you said we will look at a coordinator. So I want to see if there's an update on that. And finally, want to ask you about the cattle fever ticks effort. Since 2008, when we had that farm bill, we've been adding monies and appropriations through the help of Chairman Bishop and other folks at Farm Bureau. We've been adding monies. But in the areas of South Texas along the border, we have the Rio Grande Valley, and that causes issues because we might do our work on the U.S. side, but then you have wildlife that will cross the river. So we're trying to set up a buffer state with the governors of Mexico that border Texas. So want to see how we can work with you on fever ticks, because even though we've added millions of dollars, the containment has not shrunk. It actually has grown, and that affects our cattle industry. So those are the questions that I have. And Mr. Secretary, I really want to thank you for the great work that you all are doing. We want to be helpful to you in this Appropriations Committee.
Congressman, we established the Rural Partners Network with the $5 million that was appropriated, and we've asked in this budget for an increase to $39 million. So our ability to expand this program to other states and to other areas of the country is obviously dependent on the ability to provide the resources for the staff. What this is basically putting people in specific communities so they are there 365 days a year, working with folks at the local level to identify programs, and then working with the rural desk officers in the 13 federal agencies and 3 commissions to basically remove whatever barriers may exist to developing successful projects. We are hopeful that this pilot basically gives us a very clear idea of how we need to do business in the future in terms of a whole of government approach. So obviously the additional resources would be helpful. We haven't forgotten about Texas and the Colonias. So I can tell you that we have our rural development folks very much focused on making sure that resources are getting into and providing the technical assistance and support for projects in that area. And I'm certainly happy to work with you to encourage Secretary Villalobos and others in the Mexican government to work collaboratively with you to make sure that we are containing the cattle fever tick issue in a way that is more satisfactory than we have in the past. Obviously, what we want to do is constrain this. We don't want to see it expanded.
And again, before my time's over, I want to say thank you. And I want to say thank you on the avocado issue. I always, people talk about border crisis, but I think our crisis would have been if we would have not got those avocados from down there to cross the border. But I do want to say thank you because of your good relationship with the Mexican government that can help us diffuse some of those difficult issues that sometimes arise. So, Mr. Secretary, just for the record, and it'll depend on the generosity of this chairman, but we are making a request to increase the funding for the rural network program that you talked about. So we'll work with the chairman at the generosity of the full committee. Hopefully we can expand that to other states also, because it's a good approach. With that, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cuellar and Mr. Secretary. At this time, I am pleased to recognize the gentle lady from Minnesota, the chair of the Defense Subcommittee. Ms. McCollum, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Vilsack, good to see you. As you know, we're struggling with avian flu in Minnesota, and we in the metropolitan area are even trying to do our fair share in ceasing the spread of this by asking people to remove their bird feeders. It might sound like a small thing to do, but we're trying to do everything we can to help you and help the Minnesota avian flu. I was pleased to see that there was an increase of more than $350 million to USDA's research programs. You've been dealing with COVID-19, climate change, conflict, economic downturns. They've all contributed to the rise in hunger, and then Russia's unlawful invasion into Ukraine and the effects that that's had on global food supply. So we're all aware that costs are up, yields are going to be down, and I believe from what I've read, we're at the greatest risk with our global food supply since World War II. These impacts are being felt at home. They're also being felt around the world. Africa imports huge percentage of its food from Russia and Ukraine, and it's being hit especially hard. Wheat prices are up by 60%. Fertilizer shortages could cut food production by almost 20%. So in that continent, which already is facing severe food and malnutrition security concerns before the conflict, they could lose up to $11 billion worth of food. And then, as I said, we've got the conflict, the war in Ukraine. This feeds into a national security crisis for the United States when there's so much civil strife going on, especially for access to food. So I'm going to acknowledge the work I've been reading while the hearing's been going on, the supplemental requests. Thank you for all the work the Department of Agriculture is doing in that to address this. But I want to take just a few minutes to ask you about research. U.S. producers and consumers, they need help with improving resistance to pests, disease, and droughts, and scaling up climate resilience. So what can you tell us about the role that you hope these new investments in agriculture research will play in helping to meet not only our food here in the United States and prices families can afford, but also the global challenges and demands that you're seeing happen?
If population projections are accurate, we would need as a global community to increase food production by 50% by the year 2050 in order to feed all of the people in the world. That's a tremendous increase in productivity. And it's not going to happen unless we have the research that allows us not only to be more productive, but to be more productive in the context of a changing climate, where we may have less available water resources in some parts of the world to be able to continue productivity as we know it today. So it's incredibly important, from gene editing to adaptation and mitigation strategies for climate, that we have a robust effort on the research side. I'm part of the President's Cancer Moonshot. When I say I mean the Department of Agriculture is. I'm on the Moonshot cabinet. And the reason I'm on that cabinet is because we have the capacity through research potentially to prevent cancer, not to cure it, but to prevent it through proper nutrition, specifically precision nutrition, the ability to really focus on specific dietary needs of individuals based on their health condition, in which food and the food that they consume may very well be helpful in either preventing or mitigating the consequences of a disease that they may be prone to have. So that research is incredibly important. We're dealing with an obesity issue in this country. That obviously speaks to the need for research. We've talked about avian influenza. We've talked about African swine fever. We need vaccines. The good news is on African swine fever that we seem to be making some progress, fairly accelerated progress, in terms of the development of a vaccine that would absolutely cause a sigh of relief on the part of pork producers, not just in this country, but around the world. I could go, there are unlimited opportunities. We have aviation biofuel. There's a necessity of understanding precisely how to produce a low carbon fuel for our transportation system. The airlines are begging for this fuel. They need it. We need to do more research on precisely what feedstock actually works and how we develop logistically the supply chain for that feedstock. There are issues relative to the health of our forests that we can talk about. I could go on and on and on. The point of this is that we haven't funded research. We haven't funded it anywhere near the level of importance and significance that it has. And that was the reason why I opened today with focusing in part on research. If we don't get serious about this, if we continue to nickel and dime it, we're just not going to be able to make the progress. And others are researching. Our Chinese friends are definitely researching. We don't want to be second rate or second class when it comes to agricultural research. We need to continue to be a leader in this world, in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chair,
Chairman,
you are muted. You're muted, Mr. Chair.
I am so sorry. Thank you, Ms. McCollum, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Maine, the chair of our Subcommittee of Interior, Ms. Pingree. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing today. And Secretary Vilsack, it's always wonderful to see you, and I appreciate your spending time with our committee and talking to us about the budget for the next year. I have a couple of questions I'll submit for the record. I have some things I often talk to you about the organic rules and about climate change, but I really wanted to spend my time talking about one thing that is a relatively new issue in my state, but really a devastating issue. And that is the challenge that our farmers are finding in having their land contaminated by PFAS. I know I've communicated with the department about this a little bit, and it may be an issue that some of my colleagues haven't thought about much, but treat this as a cautionary tale, because I think that Maine has done a lot of investigation into this. Our farmers are very actively engaged in trying to understand the impact this has on their farms. But because much of the contaminated land is due to the spreading of sewage sludge on the land, much of it back in the 70s and 80s, it's likely to be appearing in states all over the country. And as I say, it's just devastating. I've participated in some roundtables with farmers in our state who already know they have contaminated land. I've met extensively with our Commissioner of Agriculture and our head of the environment. And I'm really proud of my state for investing in the funds to help farmers test their land and to do everything they can to support these farmers. But when you listen to a young family, and I know we're all anxious to have more young farmers. And we've been really proud in our state at how many young people have gotten engaged in farming. Many of them are certified organic, so they're particularly cautious about that land. But once they find out that they've gotten that diagnosis of PFAS contamination, it's just, it's a dead stop. You know, all of a sudden, the products that you've been cultivating in the greenhouse, the things you're about to plant in the land this spring, you just have nowhere to turn. Your land is contaminated, and very likely you have produce that will be unsaleable. Perhaps you have a dairy herd, which has been eating contaminated feed. Perhaps you don't have contaminated land, but you brought hay from somebody else who had contaminated land and didn't know about it. And we've just really seen the tip of the iceberg. But like I said, it's heartbreaking to talk to the farmers. Many of them are concerned about their own health because we have a lot of young farmers. A lot of them have young children who've been, you know, outside playing in the yard or drinking the water that's also contaminated. Our state is doing a wonderful job investing in testing, but it takes a long time. It takes a long time to discover which lands had sewage sludge spread on them. And there's a lot because it was a conventional practice. And probably for many years, we assumed it was a good idea. And adding fertility to the land, we didn't know that there were these permanent chemicals, PFAS, in some of that sewage sludge. And we're finding it all over our state. Some of the farmers, because they don't have time to wait for the state, are paying for their own testing. They're testing themselves and finding extremely high level of contamination in their own bodies and their children's bodies. So I just can't say enough about how hard it is to witness this going on and to realize we just don't have the resources. We don't have the science. We can't tell a farmer right now what to do to mitigate the problem, to remediate the problem. And we're still trying to figure out what are safe levels in produce, in other products, and our own CDC in the state of Maine is doing that kind of research. So I know I'm kind of going on here, but I just can't say enough about it and the importance of the USDA stepping in to help. Funds are being set up in our state to support those farmers who may be devastated economically, to do more research, to do more testing, to support the testing. But I guess, and I've contacted the USDA, and I know that you are working cooperatively with us, but what else do you need to be able to take a bigger leadership role? What kind of funding do you think you need to face this problem going into the future? And as always, I certainly invite you to come to the state of Maine, because I would love nothing more than having you sit down with some of the farmers and hearing their story firsthand and hearing with our own Department of Agriculture about how they're dealing with this.
You've correctly identified the need for more information. I think we need a national standard so that there's a better understanding of precisely what is acceptable. I think we also need to get away from the ad hoc commodity by commodity assistance program that we currently have to create more of an overall program that basically covers all the commodities. We have something for the dairy industry, but we don't necessarily have something today for produce. And so this is a significant funding issue and one that I suspect you're going to take up in the Farm Bill. And I would use this opportunity that you've raised just simply to make this pitch. We always go into the Farm Bill discussions with the notion that we have to do it within the existing budget. I think that's a mistake. And I think there needs to be some real thought about this. And we need to maybe suggest that on at least this occasion, there may be a need for additional resources in that Farm Bill to address these kinds of emerging issues that you've just identified.
Well, thank you for that. And I wholeheartedly support you in that endeavor. And we'll look forward to working with the department about all of the things that you needed, the criteria, the support, and really the change in the way that we look at supporting farmers. Because as you said, we may have some ideas about how to go about it in the dairy industry, but beyond that, we haven't given enough thought and certainly don't have the program. So thank you for your consideration. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I look forward to working with you on this challenging issue.
Thank you, Ms. Pingree, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have completed the first round of questions, and we will now begin the second round. And in that light, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, I was pleased to see a strong focus on minority serving institutions in your FY23 budget request. And in particular, I was pleased to see that it included requested increases for the Cooperative Extension Service and the programs focused on 1890 and 1994 land grant institutions. Extension programs are notable in their ability to rapidly deliver new agricultural knowledge to end users. 1890 and 1994 land grant partners are critical to ensuring that those research gains are felt equitably for all of our stakeholders across the country. As the federal partner for the nation's extension system, NIFA plays a key role in funding, organizing, and strategizing extension initiatives. What's your goal for increasing extension efforts and building up our minority-serving institutions?
Mr. Chairman, when states began to undercut and underfund extension services at the state level, extension at the 1862 land grant universities began to transition away from providing individual farmer assistance to a method of basically working with consultants who in turn worked with individual farmers. The problem is that many farmers, particularly those who have been historically underserved, don't necessarily have those crop consultants. They may not be large enough to have the crop consultant to be able to provide the assistance and technical advice. So it's essential and necessary for us to understand the necessity of providing that level of individual technical assistance to those producers. And one way to do that, obviously, is through minority serving institutions. It isn't the only way, but it is an important way because they are a trusted source in those communities for information. And so that's why we have encouraged an increased, proposed an increase in the budget to basically provide those resources to be able to do more of that. In addition, we've also, as I mentioned earlier, utilizing the Section 1006 money from the American Rescue Plan to also create multi-year commitments to provide additional technical assistance and access. This is really, really important. You can have a program, but if people don't know about it and don't know how to go through the process for applying for it, you essentially don't have a program. So this is incredibly important, and we hope that you find the wisdom in providing additional resources in this area.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. At last month's hearing with the Inspector General, we talked about the impact of the previous administration's reorganization of civil rights functions at USDA. The OIG recently issued a report that indicated that the department's civil rights strategic plan was no longer effective, especially in terms of handling complaints. During the hearing, the Inspector General stated that this was due to the decentralized nature of the approach that put more responsibility in the agencies with less oversight centrally. What's your opinion of the OIG's assessments, and do you have plans to undo that reorganization, and how are you addressing the issues identified in the IG's report?
I have a great amount of respect for the OIG and its function, and I have a good relationship with Phyllis Fong and her team. We meet on a monthly basis to basically go over investigations and audits and so forth. And so we are very serious about following the recommendations that are made in OIG reports, and that's also true of GAO reports as well. I will say that our civil rights effort has improved. We were at 69% EEO rating, and we're now at 79%, and our hope is that by the end of this fiscal year, we're closer to 100%. We have clearly focused on providing information concerning the level of complaints and the handling in a timely way of those complaints. I get a monthly report on that as well, and I've seen progress to the point where now more than 90% of all EEOC complaints are being handled in a timely way through all aspects, acceptance, denial, review, investigation, and so forth. So I think we're seeing progress. We've got more to do, and we're committed to, as part of our effort at creating a great place to work and our equity commitment at USDA, we're committed to making sure we do everything we can to follow the recommendations of the OIG.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And at this time, I will yield and recognize our ranking member, Mr. Harris, for additional questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to Ms. Secretary for being here. Obviously, very important department you run for my district. Just to follow up a little bit on the Reconnect broadband, just to express a little concern that the infrastructure law changed the threshold for underserved area, from 90% to only 50%. If you could just keep an eye on, make sure that doesn't cut out some of our rural areas or delay the build out into our rural areas, I'd greatly appreciate that. Let me just ask one question about the SNAP program. The SNAP employment and training programs are great ideas. Obviously, a hand up is just as important as a handout. And in Maryland, we have a couple of great providers, one in Annapolis that takes homeless individuals on the program and teaches them culinary skills so they can get employed in the food industry. How many new SNAP employment and training programs have you brought into the program while you've been secretary?
Well, we don't bring it's not the department's responsibility to bring those programs into, it's essentially, we provide resources to the state, and then states basically provide employment and training. When I was secretary before, we basically did a pilot project to identify best practices. For example, I can tell you the state of Washington's got a very, very good employment and training program. The one benefit that I've seen between this time and last time, we did see historically states not investing all of the employment and training money. That is no longer, I'm told that's no longer the case, that states are in fact utilizing those resources. They are taking resources in an innovative way. You mentioned Maryland's 2 programs. I think you would find that that's true in many states across the country.
Oh, that's great. If you can get back to me just with the total numbers that are being funded, I realize you're not responsible for getting them in, but what's happening down the state.
No.
That'd be great. Just going back to the global food crisis, I understand the announcement made today, over $600 billion, I guess $670 billion going to be spent with the drawdown on the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust for the commodity purchase, which is only 282 million of that. That's the amount that's going to go to American farmers. 388 million from the Commodity Credit Corporation is for necessary costs and transportation expenses. Now I have a little heartburn over that because that seems like the tail's wagging the dog. I mean, we have a way more costs of delivering the item than actually the food product itself, which obviously benefits our American farmers. And I understand that, for instance, we could save $20 million by not having the requirement for a U.S. shipper to deliver these products. Now, the Food for Peace program, we have that requirement. The shippers have to be U.S. shippers. But this is an emergency situation, and our choice is between spending that $20 million in an already congested market for shipping, or buying more product from our farmers. So, if you can address that, is the goal of the USDA to get as much product as possible there, realizing that, of course, these administrative costs look very, very high?
I had the same reaction you had. In fact, the first time I saw the number, it was actually higher than the 300 million number that you mentioned. We were able to essentially ask questions about that high number, got it down to the number where it is today. There are 2 components to this. You've mentioned one component, well, actually 3 components. You've mentioned one component. There's the cargo preference component, which is roughly about $89 million of that number. The balance of that number is basically the cost of transportation in the countries that we're sending the food to. So this is an issue of how difficult it is to get product. Once you make the decision to provide product to an Ethiopia, for example, how much does it cost to actually get it to people in Ethiopia? That's a pretty expensive proposition, apparently. So we've raised these issues. I don't think I'm not sure that I have the authority as secretary to waive those provisions. I think there are others in the administration that have that authority, and we've raised that issue, and that's a decision that will be made, obviously, by those who have the authority to do so. But we've at least put it on the table and basically made sure people were aware of the fact that we could save those resources. We're obviously looking for ways in which we can provide help and assistance. And I might add that we're also looking for ways in which we can increase productivity here at home, which is why you'll see in this proposal additional resources to increase the marketing assistance loan program and also to incent double cropping in areas where that may make sense for producers.
Thank you very much. Our time is out. I just ask you to, if we get that strategic plan for Ag Arta, that would be great. Get that off the ground, but I understand we don't have the plan yet. Anyway, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, Dr. Harris, and Secretary Vilsack. At this time, I'm happy to yield for a second round to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood. You are
Thanks,
now.
Mr. Chairman. Farmers are on the front lines of climate change, both bearing the brunt of its impacts, but also central to delivering climate solutions on the path to net zero by 2050. But they cannot do it alone. Advances in research, technical assistance, and investments in climate-smart agricultural practices through USDA will be vital to this mission. USDA's fiscal year 23 budget requests increased funding for the conservation technical assistance to address the administration's priority of addressing climate change. Secretary Vilsack, can you explain on how the agency plans to use this funding to improve assistance to producers to implement climate-smart practices?
Yes, basically what we want to be able to do is to continue to provide resources to contract with trusted community building organizations and entities that have access to and are connected, if you will, to producers, particularly historically underserved producers, to basically make sure that they are receiving information about conservation programs and receiving information about how to apply for and qualify for those conservation programs, helping guide them through the process to make sure that they actually get the assistance and help. Chief Cosby is very interested in and very committed to this. We established an appropriation or a set of resources this year. We obviously want to make sure that that continues, that technical assistance continues. I would also point out that we're also providing a $1 billion initiative on climate smart commodity and forest products. We look forward to receiving applications. The deadline for applications is about ready to expire. We anticipate and expect a very good interest in that program that will also provide support. And we have structured that program in a way that ensures that historically underserved producers can participate. And we will certainly make sure that happens.
Great. I'm encouraged by the administration's request to extend enhanced WIC cash value benefits for fruits and vegetables, which reach over 4.75 million moms and kids across the country, including many in my district. These enhanced benefits align with science-based recommendations to build on WIC's demonstrated record of improving maternal and child health. Improved maternal nutrition in particular is a key step in preemptively addressing risk factors for pregnancy as we seek to reduce instances of maternal mortality and morbidity. In your view, Mr. Secretary, how do enhanced WIC benefits strengthen WIC's public health impact?
Well, by providing greater access to fruits and vegetables, the belief is that that's obviously going to make a difference in terms of the health and well-being of pregnant women as well as their children. It's one of the reasons why yesterday I had the opportunity to speak to the Black Mayors Association conference that's being held in Washington, D.C. And I used that opportunity to encourage the mayors who were in attendance at that reception to expand access to WIC and to take full advantage of the WIC program. I'm concerned, and I know you are personally, about the fact that 50% of those who qualify for the program are currently not engaged and involved in the program. And unfortunately, many of those who are qualified that aren't involved are people of color, women of color. And so it's important and necessary for us to continue to do a better job of outreach. It's one of the reasons why we're allocating some of the resources from the American Rescue Plan to basically look at ways in which we can improve outreach to get more participation in that program. So it's not only increasing the bonus, it's also making sure that people are actually available for the regular benefits of the program.
Well, we'd certainly be interested in hearing more details about that kind of ARP-funded outreach effort, if you can have your team follow up with my office. Additionally, when can we expect USDA to comprehensively evaluate the WIC food to package, to better align it with science-based nutrition recommendations, which would strengthen WIC's positive impact on maternal and child health?
That's forthcoming in the very, very near future. I think we're very close to getting that done.
Okay, but you're committed to doing it?
Yeah, well, yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Underwood. And at this time, I recognize for a second round of questions, Mr. Valadeo from California. You are now recognized, Mr. Valadeo.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, again, thanks for this opportunity. As the Secretary, the Administrator had a nominee at the USTR for the position of Chief Agriculture Negotiator. But that nomination was recently pulled, and this position remains vacant. Although this position is not within your department, I know you understand just how important this role is to the people your department serves. This role needs to be filled as soon as possible, and I'm concerned the administration is not taking this position, and to be honest with you, trade as a whole as seriously as it should be. How do you plan to work with President Biden and USTR Representative or Ambassador Tai to support filling this role with the most appropriate candidate?
I'm aware of the fact that the trade representative just recently concluded 3 interviews for that position. I know 2 of the 3 people that she interviewed, and I can assure you that both of those individuals are highly qualified for that job, and they are taking that position extremely seriously. And we are in the process of hopefully in the final stages of getting a nominee to the undersecretary position here on trade. I would, with all due respect, Congressman, I would take a little bit of exception to the notion that we're not taking trade seriously. I can tell you that I have had more conversations on trade, more conversations with ag ministers across, in fact, yesterday was Ireland and the UK. We're doing more trade missions. We're seeing more barriers being broken and taken down in terms of additional product. And we have a record amount of exports now. I understand that there are some commodities that you're interested in where we have work to do. But on balance, we're seeing a significant increase in trade activity. So, I think in fairness, I wanted to make those points.
No, I appreciate that. And obviously my district represents, I'm going to say somewhere around 300-400 different commodities. And so, yes, there have been some where exports have increased, but there are some that they're truly struggling. And it's a tough time for a lot of farmers across the country. But I just have such a wide variety that I hear, especially the ones who are having the toughest time, I hear from the most. And so this is something that we are watching closely. And I appreciate the efforts that are being made. And hopefully we get to a conclusion soon and have someone in that position. The second one comes up a lot as well. The sign up for the second round of the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP, closed last October. A lot of my constituents have since reached out to my office asking if additional CFAP rounds will become available in the future. Our agriculture producers across the U.S., especially in my district in Central Valley, are still hurting as a result of the pandemic and other issues. Do you plan on opening up CFAP again for another round?
Well, I think it's dependent on whether or not there are resources. There are other steps that we intend to take to improve the safety net, which we expect and anticipate to be able to roll out during the spring and summer. I don't know if it's quote unquote CFAP, but I think there are additional programs that will be made available to producers.
All right. Well, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate you taking some time for us. That's really all the other questions I had. And anything else, if I have more, I'll submit for the record. So thank you for your time today and the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Valadeo and Secretary Vilsack. At this time, for a second round, I'm delighted to recognize Mr. Newhouse from Washington. You are now recognized for 5 minutes for additional questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Secretary, I know you're aware that the federal Columbia River system in the Pacific Northwest comprises 31 hydroelectric projects in the Columbia River Basin. In fact, I would say it's crucial to the ag industry, not only in my state, but the entire nation. Literally 50% of our domestic exported wheat of the United States goes through this system. And that's just one example of really how important this is to the agricultural industry. I sent you, along with several of my colleagues, a letter, I think it was dated March 15th, citing several questions about the CEQ's engagement process, the stakeholder engagement process, and the focus that breaching the lower Snake River dams would have on our agricultural sector. And if I could, I'd like to follow up on that letter. My questions are this: has the CEQ included USDA in the current stakeholder engagement process, examining the species recovery in the Columbia River Basin? And if so, what is USDA's role in that process? And And then has the USDA been consulted on the impact removing the lower Snake River dams would have on wheat producers, and specifically how removing the producer's method of transportation to the West Coast would affect U.S. wheat and other domestic markets?
Congressman, I would say that our responsibility, both with CEQ and also, I would say also with EPA, is to make sure that we are engaging with them to make sure they have all the information necessary on the impact that a particular course of action that's being considered would have on producers. That's the first thing. The second thing is to make sure that that we advocate, obviously, on behalf of producers, and depending upon what the decisions are made, that we then take a look at how we at USDA can utilize the resources we have to mitigate the consequences or impact of any decision. I mean, I don't want to tell CEQ necessarily or EPA exactly what to do, because I don't frankly want them telling me exactly what to do. But we have an advisory role, and then based on what they decide to do within their jurisdiction, we can figure out ways in which we can potentially help farmers implement, help farmers mitigate the consequences of actions. So
that, can I take from that then that USDA has been engaged with CEQ through this process? Or
I believe it has, Congressman. I could be mistaken about this, and if I am, we'll let you know. But I believe we've been engaged because that's our job and that's our responsibility.
Okay. Okay. Well, just to underscore the importance of that entire system to, like I said, the nation's agricultural industry, but particularly the Pacific Northwest and the 7 neighboring states. It's a critical piece of infrastructure that breaching dams would significantly negatively and adversely impact the industry. And I appreciate your input and your communication with the CEQ as they consider options here. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. It's been always a pleasure to see you in front of our committee. And with that, Mr. Bishop, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. And Secretary Vilsack, thank you so very much for your testimony here today. And Mr. Rapp, thank you for your attendance in support of Secretary Vilsack. We all understand how incredibly busy you are these days, so thank you for your time. Thank you also for the hard work that you and the department are doing to help lift up rural America. I look forward to working with you as we continue the fiscal year 2023 appropriations process. And along with what we've discussed, we will also forward additional questions for the record, and we will appreciate your diligence in getting your responses to us in a timely manner. I would recognize Dr. Harris, but I believe he had to excuse himself for another hearing, and so he will not be giving a closing statement. So let me just say in his absence, thank you to Dr. Harris and to all of the members in attendance, and thank you for the staff who worked so hard to pull this hearing together. With that, this subcommittee is now adjourned.